Testing one, two, three. Well, welcome. It is Wednesday office hours. Today, we're going to look a little bit at ideas about turbulence. Turbulence is described by a variety of folks. Robert Brenner, the Marxist historian, as well as Anwar Sheikh, also talks about turbulence in his magnum opus on capitalism and competition. And there are things that are shared. In fact, it may be that Sheikh got his turbulence idea from Brenner. Uh, but the issue with Brenner, of course, is that not everyone agrees with his very broad and very interesting view of history. But we will look a little bit at it. There's a summary that I've put at the end that'll sort of look at the kind of period divisions that he does, and then there's critiques of Brenner. I mean, it probably is a good thing that um, he created controversy and people respond to the kind of big ideas that's with. So what we're going to look at today is turbulence and another idea, and that is euthanizing the rentier in the context of working class, entrepreneur, and rentier. The point, of course, is that normally we would think about, um, bourgeoisie and proletarians, or um, this is just a slightly different way of thinking about it, a triad, as it were, of working class entrepreneur and rentier. Now, the rentier economy, of course, is really important relative to, the 21st century, and there's still a lot of rentiers, et cetera. But the underlying research question can be that, can this kind of turbulence give democratic commitments institutional form? Now, that's a kind of big idea, but turbulence in this sense, resembles the same kind of crisis modeling, um, that, without getting into the whole business about, you know, uh, falling rates of profit, et cetera, uh, which is very conventional and is sort of, it's one element about the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. It's just that it's not an absolute, and it isn't always the specific condition under which you have capitalist crisis, et cetera. Uh, the issues of the transformation problem, among many other things, are in the literature probably, as it were, sort of one-dimensional, in the sense that you carry the transformation problem idea through, or the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, or socially necessary labor time, and all those things are not lost or negated by what we're going to do here. In fact, they're just sort of aspects of a much kind of larger, not necessarily grander scheme. So turbulence is not a failure of policy to restore equilibrium, because equilibrium, for so many neoclassical modelers, as well as some Marxist modelers, um, is one way in which you can think about, configuring a dynamic model that is supply demand, labor versus investment, and a whole bunch of other things. But you don't necessarily, I mean, equilibrium is a underlying idea, but recall that we've been talking more about um, dynamic as opposed to static equilibrium. Yeah, despite the fact that we may have commitments to a more steady state economy, uh, Schumacher, etc. But what we want to do is, in our little quantum way, is to think about how we can reconfigure our thinking about equilibrium to include certain quantum ideas, which provide a slightly different way of thinking about it. And I would assert that the natural state of a complex, entangled, and politically observed system where the probability amplitudes should favor democratic outcomes. That is, you know, fuller employment, housing everybody, over rentier extraction, which you could argue that that's part of what went on in 2008. Um, but what's implied by this, that this would structurally require the euthanasia of the rentier. Now, this phrase, euthanasia of the rentier, goes to uh, John Maynard Keynes, who was thinking of it in a slightly different way, but he was thinking about rentiers as, parasitical. That is, they're always living off of interest. That's oversimplifying it, of course, but that they are kind of drain, the sort of unpaid labor, and that's perfectly natural in 1936 to think that you want to get to full employment, you want to rebuild the growth in the economy, you want to solve the liquidity problems, et cetera, et cetera. And also, you know uh, um, in a regulatory sense, bring the state back in as fiscal policy, et cetera, et cetera. The current state of that, and it actually is described in the little readings today, is that we are in a kind of stagflation, as some might call it. Um, we have interest rates that some people want to reduce to zero, if at all possible, and others who are just looting in the interim, taking advantage of the margins, which is what's going on. There's just a variety of looting in a bunch of different ways. And further down, we look at the idea of a CBDC, that is a central bank digital currency. The Fed is interested in this, as are other central banks. And at some moment, there will be this thing, and it's not identical to, crypto or whatever, but it is a way in which certain ideas about digital can be more fully integrated. And for a variety of reasons that could include, obviously, the same things that we would be interested in crypto for, blockchain, et cetera. Anyway, so the euthanasia of the rentier is not just as a moral goal, but as a mathematical, this is where the quantum business comes in, a mathematical necessity to collapse what under quantum thinking, as opposed to particle thinking, the wave function, into a stable democratic reality. Now, that may be, torturous in that sense, but I think it's possible, and I think that you'll see that quantum ideas are on other people's minds, and we'll get to that in a moment. I think it's important to think about capitalism as a series of contingent collapses of superpositions. So a superposition is something that is, to oversimplify, something that is laid on top of another. thing, but it can apply in a mathematical sense, but also in a geological sense, or as I was trying to introduce the idea of pastry, the millefeuille, um, that is, there's a kind of layering that goes on that is superpositioning, if you will, or that has a family resemblance to that. So we're going to look at first, we're going to do the same thing like I usually do, and it's sort of skip to the end and then come back to the beginning. Um, and I didn't, I've only recently come to this portion of Slavoj Žižek's work, but I noted, of course, that uh, uh, being ever so on the cusp of this kind of thinking, Zizek has a whole thing on a kind of quantum history. Now, quantum history is not necessarily identical to quantum economics, and in fact, it could raise the issue of, uh, and without getting into the empirical nature of it, but it would actually bring something to cliometric or quantitative history, um, to be or to include quantum modeling, that is, with amplitude, probability amplitudes and stuff like that, depending on the historical model. And that idea of building models, or, from analogies and metaphors, is what we looked at in prior weeks as an important set of procedures, depending on the kind of overall structure you're trying to get at. That is, if you were looking at a Kuhnian, that is a Thomas S. Kuhn um, um, sort of model of scientific development, or scientific revolution, you can see that it's important to see these conflicts, contradictions, all those sorts of things that are part of the dynamic of not only simply writing about history, but looking at kind of the general problem or issue of physical science modeling, of or quantitative comparisons to other social science activity. So, dismissing the hope that either science or democracy will deliver a coherent future, Slavoj Žižek argues that quantum mechanics from physics demands a new philosophy of quote unquote quantum history, in which reality is incomplete and events retroactively reshape the past that they emerge from. Now, you could say, in fact, that this is highly problematic in the sense that this resembles, retconning or revisionist history. Well, that's only if you take certain ideological positions, and this is not necessarily what one is doing. But anyway, that's another story. So, a quote from Zizek: "If you had a conventional Western education like mine, then science is taught as the discovery of laws of nature that are always exact, regardless of whether anyone or anything is watching. This observational business is the most important thing. In the quantum world, a particle is in a superposition of possible positions and velocities described by a wave function until one of these is fixed by an observation, the other one then necessarily becoming unknowable. So you're looking at a dynamic situation that has shifting points of view. And in that sense, it resembles, a certain idea about deconstruction, which, is not uh, it's not the way in which all deconstruction is built, but it does share this idea of a certain synchrony of observation that occurs within a deconstructive context. But anyway, and also it implies that the idea of a trace and deconstruction actually can kind of apply in a quantum sense. But we don't have Derrida around to sort of opine on that. So, before we get to which is probably the conclusion we want to get to, but and we'll probably come back to this anyway to build the beginning, is about 7 steps to democratic renewal, euthanizing the rentier. Recall that if there's an entrepreneur class and a working class, there is a rentier class. People who live off their interest income, and they are a certain part of the economy, and uh, and you can argue of whether what they how they survive or how they sustain themselves is off of interest, and then against that, that is euthanizing the rentier, is to try and force people not living on interest, especially if you had an economy, as Keynes imagined, that would ultimately resolve itself, that is, with perfect employment or full employment, which without getting into the whole thing about that it's never really full, but this idea of more full employment and then a decreasing in interest rates, so there would be no interest rates, everything would be more fluid. There might even be no money, but that's a whole nother thing. So we'll get back to that in a second. It's an interesting article because it only came out, 2 weeks ago or last week. This is by Will Beeman, who is one of Scott Ferguson's graduate students in Florida. So it's just an interesting way of thinking about it. Not that it's a absolute solution or anything earth-shattering, but it does suggest certain policy ideas that the Democratic Party should think about. Certainly, Democratic Socialists, etc., should think about some of these elements as policy items that are part of what a democratic socialist economy might actually look like. So we'll get back there in a moment. So going to the end, and then I'll read this more closely because one is a review of Zizek's book, but the other one is an actual Zizek article. So the section I built it on, or whatever, is 2 videos. They're very short, on Zizek talking with a podcaster, Philip Robinson, on Marxism and quantum mechanics. And it's rather, isn't fully articulated. It's only about 5 minutes. And then associated with that is one on Marxism, quantum mechanics, and artificial intelligence. So you can see, Zizek is right on the leading edge of the current set of problems, but of course he's approaching it from his, combination of Lacan and, anyway, a post-structural approach in that sense. All right. Dismissing the hope that either science or democracy will deliver a coherent future, Slavoj Žižek argues that quantum mechanics demands a new philosophy of quantum history in which reality is incomplete and events retroactively reshape the past they emerge from, which sounds an awful lot sounds revisionist or reformist even. Or retroactive continuity, retcon. So it's not any of those things, but you can see there's a resemblance. So as we know from psychoanalysis, as well as from cognitive sciences, consciousness is always an intersubjective phenomenon. And note, of course, that quantum applications, quantum science, is applied in ways in which you can talk about managerial subjectivity could be seen in that decision making can be seen in a kind of quantum way, but that's kind of over determining what what your results are going to be. But it is an intersubjective phenomenon, no different than revolutionary subjectivity or consciousness, which is pretty important for activists. So, how then can quantum mechanics, as a complete theory of reality, no, complete, is a totalizing adjective, but a more complete, probably, theory of reality explain itself as an intersubjectively shared universal theory? So, note that there are certain words in here that are, have problematic implications. We need to be careful about what it is. So there's an article by Zizek and a review of Zizek's work. So let's look at the review and then do Zizek himself. This is Sean Sheehan's review of Quantum History, A New Materialist Philosophy, done for Bloomsbury. That the structure of quantum history is tripartite will not come as a surprise to seasoned readers of its author. Each of the three parts, and we've looked at this before relative to Hegel, etc., universal, particular, and singular, has 3 chapters, and there are also 9 supplements labeled variations. The style of writing, with Zizek's lack of self-importance and his hyper-cerebral, erudite, and maverick frame of mind shining through the text, may also be familiar. The book's subtitle is pretty a grand idea. A New Materialist Philosophy is grounded in quantum history's questioning of a traditional understanding of materialism and its assurance that everything can be reduced to some piece of matter, which, at its most essential, accounts for what's experienced as a sense effect. So that you can see philosophically, there's a whole, epistemological and ontic thing going on here. The implications of quantum physics, the book argues, call for a revision of this assurance. That is, that everything can be reduced to some sort of matter. Part 1 takes a critical look at accounts of the quantum universe, primarily by Thomas Hertog, of which we'll talk about. Zizek himself will comment in the next little thing. Carlo Rovelli, Sean Carroll, and Lee Smolin. Their theories are not always compatible and often suggest bewildering paradoxes, which, sort of is the stuff of post-structuralism, but, paradoxes don't emerge there. They certainly go all the way back in history. And they also pose the haunting question of how a neutral medium / container in which entities exist, that is, this neutral medium container, time and space, comes into being. So you see here, the certain ideas about space-time sort of floating around, and obviously its overlap with other things that the physical sciences present. Note, of course, that this is our interest in physics is not because we're interested in physics, but rather the use of physics as economists do. That is, in econophysics, that on the one hand tends to use neoclassical models because the math is easier, but it's possible to do that variety of econophysics as a kind of political economy, one that is classical in the sense that Anwar Sheikh sort of talks about it, that is identifying Marx with Adam Smith and David Ricardo and that whole milieu. But also thinking about the analogy made by whole bunches of people with, between economics and physics. The theoretical physicists and cosmologists agree on the absence of any single variable that could account for both quantum indeterminacy and a deterministic reality governed by entropy. Their narratives, notwithstanding significant differences, point towards a pre-ontological space. Now, there's all kinds of other stuff that would, we'd have to explain what is a pre-ontological space. That does not make sense to ordinary ways of reasoning. This gets into a whole bunch of other things, and Zizek, verges into discussions of Heidegger and Kierkegaard at some moment. So, but that's what philosophers do. And what's interesting, of course, is, as we'll read further down, is um, talking about Heidegger is useful because you need to have the radical left sort of needs to have fascism around so that you can see what's wrong, as it were, what needs to be corrected, which is kind of the current point in history at which, at least in the U.S., where we are. In the quantum world, the conditions of knowing affect what becomes known, and this provides a point of entry. Recall Althusserian point, entry points. A point of entry or overlap with Marxism, theories of language, Freud, Lacan, and, as the title of the first chapter indicates, Hegel. Why quantum mechanics needs Hegel. You can see already that's an incredible challenge. To see these connections and the importance attached to Hegel, Zizek considers an experiment conducted by Anton Zellinger, in which photons are registered in ways that complicate the accepted idea in quantum mechanics that a process remains in a state of superposition until an observation minimizes multiple possibilities and collapses it into a version that takes its place in our ordinary reality. Now, we can draw all kinds of metaphors and analogies relative to this multiplicity that becomes real, but let's just continue on. Ravelli explains this in terms of non-commutativity. That is, the order of events matters. First A and then B is different from first B and then A, because they're in a dialectical relationship with one another. The nature of the relationship is similar to Zizek's Hegelian reading of the non-commutative order between contingency and necessity in his text Less Than Nothing. In quantum history, in the book Quantum History, this is also elaborated with references that range from the biblical fall from grace, to Hitchcock, from Marx to Deleuze. That's, a whole range of things. No one-way directional line is seen to exist between possibility and actuality, because possibility is deemed to be completely open. Now, this is the contrast that you make here is that you could argue, not that that's always the case, but things like neoclassical economics is a kind of closed system, or it is, it has certain formal or functional elements that allow the math to sort of work out, and you can derive all kinds of other interesting ideas about linear things, etc., as a function of that. All right, the radical import of this is credited to Hegel. There is a confluence of quantum mechanics and Hegel that reaches a peak with the notion of, the big deal for Hegel, absolute knowing and its state of non-reliance on our knowledge of the past. This is the movement forward, dialectically speaking. A radical openness prevails in the same way as in quantum mechanics. Each collapse retroactively structures its own genesis. So what you see here is a model of, motion or continuation. that resembles, as we were talking before last week or whatever, about multiple circuits of capital, Department One and Department Two, and other things like that. Because, and as I said, they overlap in a variety of ways, whether you think of it as sets, nested sets, or whatever. Rescuing Hegel from Heidegger's criticism that logos cannot amount to or account for an ontology entails recognition of a pre-discursive dimension to Hegel that constitutes a space of radical negativity beyond the transcendental. Now, that's really, there's a lot of stuff there that take up too much time to sort of explain it, but consider this as sort of the front end of a model. This space, described by Hegel in Janer Real Philosophy as the night of the world, is for Zizek an acknowledgement of a non-spiritual, mystical ground. It deepens, but does not subvert historical materialism, because contact with this space, the real, remains an encounter with external reality. Now, this is a different way of thinking, or, well, it's not that different from certain points of view about critical realism, which has certain positions on external reality and sort of the scientific project. Now, part two of quantum history begins and ends with Heidegger, prompted in part by Robert Pippin's reading of Heidegger in The Culmination 2024. Finitude for Hegel, for whom the human being is a, note, catastrophe or catastrophe, is inextricable from historicity, radical contingency, and the disclosure of being. It's a lot of big words there, but this is kind of positioning, how things fit together and are connected. Contingency being, of course, a really important element of how we think about historical things. For Zizek, respecting but also contesting Pippin, this is not merely an exception in an otherwise ontologically coherent universe, but a catastrophe or catastrophe that grounds reality itself. So this is a kind of inverted relationship to what we may think of as a catastrophe. And if you've been following along with the other things that I was fiddling around with, Renee Thom's work on catastrophe to model it represents that kind of way in which you, in the fold, as it were, the catastrophic fold is where a new reality can be built, because it so superimposes a kind of warp in the model, and it has mathematical coherency as well. So, quote, the disturbance of the void by quantum oscillations is seen as a version. The disturbance of the void by quantum oscillations is seen as a version of the catastrophe, preferred by quantum physics. Other fault lines in Heidegger are laid bare. Pippin notes that capitalism is the unspoken name for the technocratic manipulation of modern life that Heidegger decries. Note, of course, that there's always the continuing discussions of, well, maybe we've already resolved that, about Heidegger being a member of the National Socialists, etc. Class struggle, Zizek notes, is for Heidegger even more unmentionable. Heidegger's politics cannot be divorced from his silence about class. As this section of the book concludes, fascism is connected with resistance to capitalism. And this actually is, important. There's a kind of a crass individualism that underlies fascism that is not necessarily supportive of capitalism. It is a kind of, if you use Italy and Germany as examples. It is more of a monopoly or oligopoly version. It's not uh, a more open capitalism. So we have here non-commutativity, but in an inverted order. And this is important because this is kind of the way the current history might be described. There is no radical emancipation without a fascist threat. And that's kind of where we are now. There is an unfolding fascist threat that needs to be uh, reined in and dissolved. Uh, I mean, it went through a growth period 10 years ago where they were hiring more uh, uh, DHS, CBP, and ICE folks, and it's become the state that uh, um, someone described it as being the 13th largest military force in the world. I'm not sure that's quite the case, but it's sort of interesting to think of it that way. Now, the final part of quantum history, subtitled Politics in a Quantum World, examines contemporary capitalism and its defanging of collective visions. That is, a world, as Anton Jaeger described in his book Hyperpolitics, where public spheres, if you follow Habermas, the idea of a public sphere is really important for the development of political communication and democracy. That's a feature of, and the public sphere is goes all the way back to the Greeks and the chorus, etc. So a public sphere is the common, the places to have discourse, etc. So where public spheres have lost their durability, for Zizek, quote, we live in an era of the superpositions of different futures. Different futures are, certainly possible, and certainly it is what clashes. Um, um, but one where Thomas Hertog's optimism that knowing this provides a basis for wise choices is seen as less convincing than a holographic approach to history. Now, that may seem like a buzzword, but the idea of a hologram is, of course, constructed from uh, multiple notions of light, um, and um, and it's and holograms are organized in slightly different ways, and it can be argued, as some people in uh, cognitive science have argued, that the mind is structured like a hologram, which may or may not be the case. Returning to the idea that a wave function's collapse leaves traces, and note that can be used to refer to the traces that Derrida uh, mentions, a wave function's collapse leaves traces in its result of other possible superpositions. So you have this kind of thing where you can sort of get confused, but it is a kind of sort of a network thing, and you can see how this can relate to certain ideas about other network entities. Anyway, introduced in one of his Against Progress essays, Zizek illustrates the point with examples ranging from the Inca to Putin, from Tibet and the Amish to the falsity of Christian and Muslim fundamentalism. One superposition attains hegemony, while traces of alternatives remain dormant. But the struggle to reawaken other possibilities goes beyond vulgar Marxism and its reduction of life to competing economic interests. And that is a thing that is more prevalent in the European context, that there are a lot more practitioners of a kind of vulgar Marxism. It's a very economic determinism, and it's a strange kind of orthodoxy that, while coherent, is highly problematic for, all kinds of historical reasons, but I mean, I think the reality is also weird as well. Uh, but anyway, the Nazis who died fighting, it is observed, were not just satisfying the objective interests of capital. Of course, they weren't. In this regard, ideology, subjectivity, what IA, artificial intelligence, cannot yet do. I think there's this, there are a lot of claims for AI, but there's just some things it can't do or may never do. But anyway, Wittgenstein and the deadlocks of symbolic expression are all touched on in the penultimate chapter of this final part. The free-ranging approach continues in the final chapter, which opens with the nature of a vocation as a way of revealing the human need for a cause, but one without the illusions of the ardent believer in some higher meaning or purpose. So there's a certain kind of way in which meaning is built in that sense. Faith, not belief. This is that differentiation, which kind of is important. The difference between faith and belief should sustain subjective engagement. Returning to the thrust of his text, Christian atheism, Zizek evokes Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein's separation of showing from saying to champion the return of Christ in the community of believers, not supported by any big other. Kantian ethics and the existential plight facing Ukrainians draw the chapter to a brooding conclusion. You can see kind of where he's headed, and we're now in the fifth year of the Russian-Ukraine war. So, there's this kind of overlap. So the 9 variations and the conclusion following the book's 3 main sections, that's how it's been described, make up 40% of the book, and they are testimony to Zizek's characteristic way of making cross-cutting connections between ideas in Hegel, Marx, Lacan, and a Catholic host of other thinkers and disciplines. Concatenations emerge through an insubordinate rhizomatic process, this is, very post-structural, that creates constellations of ideas and opinions. And while the variations to be read as an extended footnotes to the individual chapters, many also stand in their own right as important expressions of Zizekian thought. The second one, pages 243 to 60, a robust defense of his philosophical use of quantum processes against Simonides' criticism in his forthcoming book, The Contingent Universal, reiterates the point that these processes are not some ultimate reality, but are indicative of a foundational ontological gap, returned to in the book's conclusion on page 377. Throughout the variations, terms and tropes from quantum mechanics are deployed in revisiting political, psychoanalytic, and cultural topics explored in his earlier books. But his current readings are always fresh and insightful, and you can see, things change. They're contingent in looking at Zizek's own work. He's reassessing what he has written before. Whether they're about music, a Beethoven symphony, Wagner's Tannhäuser and Tristan, particular works of art, Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World, Gustave Courbet's The Origin of the World, which is, an interesting little piece, partially because it's it can be seen as, it's erotic, let's put it that way. And for a realist like Courbet, it's kind of it has its own interesting life and peace, and its own, provenance is interesting, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can look at it up yourself. Or classic and recent movies, Rashomon, Monsters, M. Butterfly, Real, Conclave. What comes across is confirmation of an undiminished intellectual virtuosity. The flair for humor is on display, as usual, in the 8th variation, with its sexually inflected reading of modern philosophy, on a par with the passage about European toilets, which, that's in our pod, that's kind of an interesting topic. at the beginning of the plague of fantasies. Succinct summaries from Descartes to Heidegger serve as a light-hearted hors d'oeuvre for a restatement about sexuality and sexual differences through the optic of superpositions. So I know that seems a little dense, but it is a kind of a reworking of certain ideas. Sinewed, subtle, wearing its schematization lightly and distinguished by clarity of thought and expression, quantum history is trademark Zizek. It resists being easily taxonomized, and with the gravitational pulls of Hegel and Lacan still in place, it calls for resolute intellectual engagement with a fundamental philosophical question, that is, the asking of not how, but why reality appears to us, why it appears to itself out of a non-all-becoming that is a becoming in itself. I know that it's probably better in German, thoroughly extracted from its corporeal base. Out of the contradictions of the fundamental void, collapses of wave functions become a way of resolving the irresolvable, that is, pure difference that Freud and Lacan called das Ding, that is, the thing. Schelling's image of nothing's hunger to be something is called upon to describe the impossibility that haunts negativity and the enigma of what earlier in his book Zizek terms the pain of infinite difference or difference. So lack of meaning is not to be mistaken for despair, and quantum phenomena become a way of seeing how history retrospectively systematizes the contingent into necessity. Political actualities emerging from contingent collapses of multiple possibilities can be changed when a dynamic, non-evolutionary, and quantum-motivated ontology validates a Benjamin-infused dialectical materialism. There's a lot going on there. But it is talking about a certain way of thinking about history. That is, that there is more of a set of intersubjective and multiple viewpoints that allows for those things that we were looking at in a sort of post-structural thing, which for Western Marxism is sort of going way over the edge and not really cohering to certain Marxist ideas, and which is trashed by some people, being identified as a quote unquote Western Marxism. So now to this is not very long, and it's a little piece, single page actually, by Zizek himself, Superpositions, Quantum and Historic. In his book, On the Origin of Time, Thomas Hertog's memoir of his collaboration with Stephen Hawking, he forcefully asserts the quantum nature of nature, inclusive of its eternal laws. That is, the laws of physics are not set in stone, but are born and co-evolve as the universe they govern takes shape. At the beginning, they were multiple, that is, caught in a Darwinian struggle for survival, and our laws are the laws which won. Is this not a supreme case of how a general law of nature contingently emerges out of a contingent singular situation? To understand this, we should make a step further into the weird ontology implied by quantum physics and conceive observation as integral to understanding reality. So, quote, if you had a conventional I've read this paragraph before, Western educational mind, then science is taught as the discovery of laws of nature that aren't always exact, regardless of whether anyone or anything is watching. In the quantum world, a particle is in a superposition of possible positions and velocities described by a wave function until one of these is fixed by an observation, the other one then necessarily becoming unknowable. So this is talking about, about a kind of a set of dialectical relations, or you can call them circuits or whatever, where things come into view and then disappear. Hawking and Hertog here avoid the trap of getting lost in the debate on what really counts as observation. That's, of course, equally problematic, Schrodinger, etc. They endorse the broadest view. Quote, the observer doesn't have to be human or sentient, even. Any record of quantum events is a form of observation. So when a quartz crystal preserves the path of a subatomic particle that passed through it, the crystal acts as an observer, close quote. So this is Zizek, right, writing. This is why we should also reject the reading of quantum mechanics, which proposes a supreme observer, that is, sometimes God is directly evoked, which fully constitutes reality. So the basic quantum mechanics claim that only through observation a wave function collapses into an actual route. Prior to that moment, it was traveling through all possible routes, explains what Hawking and Hertog mean by top-down cosmology. So taking a top-down observer-inclusive approach to the conundrum of the anthropic principle makes it a non-paradox. From a classical perspective, it seems extraordinary that the laws of physics should have at every choice taken the path that resulted in a life-compatible universe. But if we are only now switching on the telescope and observing the fragment of the wave function that we live in, then it necessarily has to be one that supports life. We might be fixing a fragment that was very unlikely statistically to have arisen from repeated rolls of the dice, but then all the options are more or less unlikely. Now, so this brings us to the third crucial notion, that of a hologram, the image of an object which catches not only its actual state, but also its interference pattern with other options that were lost when the actual state imposed itself. This is the idea of, how light operates in hologram construction. While I am, of course, not qualified to pass a judgment on these notions from quantum mechanics, this is Zizek, I find it irresistible to apply them to human history. Now, perhaps the supreme example of holographic history is provided none other than by Marx. Marx is not an evolutionist. He writes history top down. That is, his starting point is the contemporary global capitalist order. And from this point, he reads the entire history as a gradual approximation to capitalism. This, and this is important here, this is not teleology. History is not guided by capitalism as its telos, but once capitalism emerges, it provides the key to the entire prehistory. So here enters Marx's well-known story in the Grundrisse of linear development from prehistorical societies and primitive communism through Asiatic despotism, antique slavery, and feudalism to capitalism. So this is the path of modes of production. But again, there is no teleological necessity in this development. It results from a series of contingent collapses of superposition. You could actually, at this moment, argue that uneven developments are kind of superpositions. But anyway, so that's so I just wanted to read this short piece because it's Zizek himself writing on this issue, and then obviously there was a book review. So I included two videos, short ones, Zizek himself talking. So going back to the beginning here, I will review certain things because we're pressed for time. So let me begin with the kind of overall the conclusion that we want to derive from our little yakking today. The rentier, him or herself, is a kind of problematic figure. Retirees are rentiers, but so are non-retiree rich folks or others. So euthanize the rentier. 7 Steps to Democratic Renewal, this is by Will Beeman. by Money on the Left, which is an interesting podcast webpage. John Maynard Keynes's call for the euthanasia of the rentier has long occupied an uneasy place on the left. In the decades after World War II, as a domesticated bastard Keynesianism became part of Cold War economic governance, the phrase often came to symbolize an idealist hope that class antagonism could be managed away through lower interest rates and expert macroeconomic policy. Some people actually believe that, which is pretty naive, but it's interesting. Yet Keynes's metaphor permits a more capacious program than interest rate management alone. Read today, amid the renewed possibility of left governance after Trump, the euthanasia of the rentier could be taken up as a deeper provocation. Rather than asking how to protect democracy from finance, we must ask how to redesign finance so that democratic commitments become the highest priority promises in the system, which they aren't now. That they're just things that are anti-democratic, and interventions and repression and theft and corruption and all that's going on right now, and they are not democratic commitments. So today, promises to private creditors are treated as inviolable, while democratic commitments, that is, to employment, education, housing, public health, reparations, libraries, and ecological repair, are treated as mere aspirations to be fulfilled only sometimes as discretionary expenditures. In other words, they're seen as relatively external. Euthanizing the rentier begins with inverting this hierarchy. Private financial claims should remain enforceable only insofar as they do not undermine the standing promises a democracy makes to the people it governs. The Roosevelt Four Freedoms, etc. And that means giving democratic commitments institutional form. In a few words, that's really pretty much what, being pro-democratic is. So here's the list. Reparations should be recognized by central banking and public finance institutions as a permanent public obligation capable of capitalizing the institutions charged with carrying it out. Libraries, schools, and guaranteed employment should be recognized as productive public assets rather than accounting costs. Public balance sheets should be organized around expanding democratic capacity instead of maximizing return to creditors. So what does this mean concretely and institutionally? First, it means establishing a hierarchy of public promises. Employment, housing, health, education, climate obligations, reparations, and basic public services become primary public commitments. When private financial promises conflict with this, they're restructured and are written off completely. This is not where we are now, considering, private prisons and attempts to kill off Social Security and Medicare, et cetera, et cetera. Capitalists would prefer not to have anything that resembles social welfare, that it should all be, disentangled and decentralized and broken up, fragmented, so that more profit can be built. But anyway, that's another story. Second, it means turning democratic obligations into financeable public assets. Law should authorize institutions to record the capacities that reparations, the right to a job, create as durable public assets, and to issue claims against the continuing public commitment to maintain them. Third, changing central bank collateral rules. Central banks should accept bonds and obligations issued for democratically authorized purposes, purchase them directly or through public intermediaries, and provide permanent refinancing facilities. Private investors should have no role to play. You can see how this sort of overlaps what Ralph Nader has mentioned in a variety of ways. We'll see a bit more of that. Fourth, it means building public balance sheet institutions wherever it's possible. Public banks, reparation trusts, employment authorities, housing funds, and municipal finance facilities should be empowered to hold public assets, issue promises of their own, and collateralize public commitments. And there's other ways of approaching this, and there's many that have been proposed. Reorganizing what counts as labor credits or whatever. Fifth, cut out bond markets. There are other ways to tell if an investment is sustainable than if it makes money for a rich person. This would be really important to change. Charter public banks and have them purchase bonds and deposit interest in public coffers, like money on the left's Seattle Loop plan. So number six, formalize the breaking of creditor power by making creditor claims revisable by design rather than only during emergencies. This is that business of crises and bailouts and other things that are actually make debt even more problematic. Lastly, number seven, reform public accounting. Fiscal rules should measure whether spending creates and sustains real capacities rather than treating all public outlays as costs. Record jobs, functioning institutions, public knowledge, and social stability as assets and capacities, not as costs. So you can see in these seven things that you're shifting an entire point of view about how governments or governance is organized, and this would require changing a whole bunch of rules, legal structures, and you could argue that unlike the Charter City, Freedom City movement, that this is a more democratic way to approach the problem. The way in which charter cities and the Charter Cities movement and the Freedom Cities movement are organized is that they want to be able to, because it's all libertarian driven. They want to be able to experiment with not having taxes, or that somehow the Freedom City creates a perfect market so that everyone's needs are met because it's a perfect free market, which is as they say, BS. In summary, euthanizing the rentier should prompt a constitutional reordering of public finance. Democratic commitments must be formalized as durable claims on the state. Institutions must be created to carry and refinance those claims, and private creditors must lose the power to decide whether those promises are affordable. And this covers a whole variety of sins, including healthcare, etc. So, an interesting article, and it's worth considering, and these are things that could be changed. I mean, there would be the usual democratic wrangling over what counts as rules or whatever, but people need to get this totally shifts the way in which we think about finance. In the same light, public financing elections could be built from this reorganizing of public finance. In other words, it would, you would only have an election fund that would be specified and paid out from, public coffers only, and no private funds could be, deployed and using the tax laws to be able to, control that, whatever. Well, it requires more regulatory discipline, etc. Anyway, so this is a brief paragraph that describes John Maynard Keynes' call for the euthanasia of the rentier as long occupied an uneasy place on the left. Bastard Keynesianism, yet Keynes's metaphor permits a more capacious program than interest rate management alone. Rather than asking how to protect democracy from finance, we must ask how to redesign finance so that democratic commitments become the highest priority promises in the system. Now, I included, for those who don't know what Keynesianism is, that the Richard Wolff explaining in as brief a way as possible the differences among neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian economics, and because we did cover that a couple of weeks ago, and an explanation, and fairly recently, of dialectic at work, Keynesian economics versus Marxian economics with Richard Wolff. Now, some other things came up, and it's not that we're always doing, sort of tedious left-wing stuff. The Mies people, the von Mies and Hayek, conservatives, Austrian school, also provides some descriptions that we'll spin through quickly, and they have a point of view on Keynesianism, not very correct or not as accurate as one means, but it is interesting that it explains, a zero pure rate of return on capital in a closed economic system. So could you drive the interest rate to zero within one generation approximately? And the implication, of course, to bring about the euthanasia of the rentier, Keynes proposed that, and this is 1936, that the stock of capital be increased through state management of investment or state control of investment. Needless to say, that's socialistic and problematic for a whole bunch of folks. I included an article here that is the commentary on Brenner, and he juxtaposes that against two other writers, and this is mapping a turbulence. So without getting too crazy about this, Seth Ackerman and Tim Barker, the people that he's talking about, criticizing Brenner's point is that there's certain shifts that represent the way in which, and if you read it too rigidly, it appears as if Brenner's argument is one driven by structurally by a productivity bias, that is, for manufacturing, etc., and which is not the way in which you can simplify what Brenner does, because he talks about a whole bunch of other things, and he has actually a way of looking at the history, and he includes, of course, as I mentioned before, central bank digital currency and a variety of other matters. I included Anwar Sheikh's work to show that turbulence, in his approach, which is Marxian but also classical, he describes at various moments about turbulent gravitation. So Anwar Sheikh's broad thesis revolves around the idea that there is an alternative tradition embedded in the classical approach of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, which insists on understanding the world on his own terms rather than from an idealized economy from which the real world deviates. This is the problem of neoclassical economics. This approach focuses on what is termed real competition. He has a whole thing about what counts as real, wherein competition between firms, each seeking to get the highest price they can, leads to and this is where econophysics kicks in, turbulent gravitation of prices around values. You can see that's, there's math that will come into play. As such, and this is the important point, there is never an equilibrium, but a dancing around some key deeper parameters. So this is not a support of the kind of equilibrium model that we would see in a Keynesian or a neoclassical model. Anyway, so there's that, and there's a little article here that has a little bit of a problem that needs to be re-edited in English, but the comments on Sheikh's work is that he spent a decade, I think, working on problems of price indexes and the concept of a chain index, which is one way in which you can evaluate things over periods, over multiple periods, if you were doing certain types of analysis, and using indices, and that may seem problematic, but it is actually a one method introduced by Alfred Marshall in 1887. So it's not like it's a new idea. It's just another way of trying to work through the accounting problems. Uh, um, so, and then it has, things, acronyms that annoy us. But the GEX method is an approach for comparing prices across countries, which is what Sheikh was interested in, is using, sort of large scale World Bank stuff, to look at, is something that we might call surplus value sort of being created, et cetera. And it has other elements, Gini figures, et cetera. And then I included an article by Robert Poland on socialization of investment and euthanasia of the rentier, the relevance of Keynesian policy ideas for the contemporary U.S. economy. And so there's something that Poland's probably more interested in, is the comprehensive socialization of investment. So the paper argues to a significant degree the stagnation of the contemporary U.S. economy can be attributed to the nature of its capital market-based or exit-led financial system, which promotes, and this is the current problem, I mean, I think you can see this all at work, short-termism, speculation and financial fragility, as well as excessive political power for the rentier class, and etc. And then I included another euthanasia of the rentier, the rent in capitalism since Keynes's general theory, that which is his magnum opus. And another thing by Atsushi Naito on the relevance of the euthanasia of the rentier concept. And I think I'm ready to stop. I also included an article that describes the work by Foley, Gordon Foley, and Anwar Sheikh about how there's a difference, or an issue of predictive and descriptive aspects of Marxist theory. That is, one of the knocks against a whole bunch of economic theories is whether it's purely descriptive or whether you can get prescriptive or predictive elements from it. And so even if many remain skeptical of Marxist theory of value as a predictive theory, there are fruitful interpretations of Marxist theory as a descriptive theory, where the emphasis is on describing fundamental processes of capitalist economies, like the allocation of social labor, capitalist competition, and exploitation. Certainly enough, for work by Foley, Sheikh, and others. So, and then I included two little things because, when we talk about Zizek, we have to talk about other things too. Deleuze and Guattari's assemblage, or agencement, is kind of useful in thinking about spatial issues and a quantum set of ideas. Not that I'm going to, explicate that in Deleuze and Guattari's work, but I think it's there actually. And then I included, because it was just available, how the state is still sort of part of the problem or part of the solution. And going back to the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, you see, how you model history and the role of the state, and that revolutions arise not because of heroic individuals, but rather more structural issues, which is what Marx is thinking about. And then I put the whole business under an LLM, and it took, of course, several tries to get it to not be so dogmatic. It usually takes a second try with more specificity to get to actually properly sort of explicate what the issues are. And so I it does a summary, or I made it do a summary. I asked it to do a summary, and the way in which Brenner's work can be described in this way, and in fact, they're reasonable periodic descriptions. That is, there's a long boom from the 1950s to 60s. There's a crisis of profitability that goes from 65 to 73, and that, of course, includes issues with the Vietnam War, et cetera, overcapacity, too little exit, too much entry, the long downturn, which it's a 20-year downturn, and a lot of people don't want to study it that way, but there's a couple of these articles that discuss Piketty's approach to capital, and uh, not that it's perfectly accurate, but it does describe certain ways in which you have to think about, income, wages, etc. And then, of course, there's the fragile revival, which includes bubbles and other little things. The new economy stock market bubble, the reverse Plaza Accord, which it's a devaluation of U.S. currency in order to change trade, which is a sort of a G7 issue. Not all G7 countries went to the plaza to do this thing, but you can see that it was compelled by the Clinton administration, among others. And the summary of Brenner's argument is that Brenner posits that the turbulence of the last 50 years, because his book is on turbulence, is not caused by supply side shocks like oil crises, which some people still believe it's simply the oil crisis. It's a whole bunch of other things, or labor demand, that is the wage squeezes, which do occur, but it's not fully caused by these two elements, but by the structural dynamics of manufacturing competition, which describes in a larger way, and particularly during the whole period of that manufacturing competition really is, it's how Germany and Japan are brought back into the world economy, et cetera, et cetera. And needless to say, the U.S. benefits from that. So Arishi critiques Brenner for ignoring the role of labor resistance, the political context of the Cold War, the rise of the global South, arguing that Brenner's focus is too narrow to manufacturing and intercapitalist competition. Well, the point is that his argument is an overaccumulation or overproduction argument as well, and is actually consonant with a variety of Marxist positions. And it's not like he's not concerned with labor issues. It's just simply that he's chosen to look at the structural dynamics as opposed to, I mean, it doesn't make him a class traitor of some kind to do that. Then I included a couple of quantum articles and that begin to be applied, which I think are, they're actually kind of interesting to see how that works. As I said, they're largely driven by neoclassical needs or elements, but of course there is a quantum money sector, which is kind of the leading edge of the current position of what is quantum money, which is kind of an interesting sort of evolving set of ideas. So I think I've gotten to the end of my yammering here. So let me see if there's any comments or questions in the chat. Quantum toilets. Entryism, yes, there is entryism at work. Entryism is always an issue. I mean, there is a kind of dynamic element in there. I'm not cool with fascism being around, and I'm not either. Let's see. Thank you for including some other stuff. Yes. Sean Carroll's podcast. I'm not sure I'm ready for Zizek on, um, Zizek takes a little work to sort of, you gotta go, "Oh, now he's flipped into a philosophical thing," and if you can sort of get through that, it actually makes a little bit of sense. Let's
Andy,
see
is
what
that an owl I can hear in the background?
No?
I'm hearing an owl every now and again.
Ooh. Ooh. No,
What
no
about you?
owls here. No
Hmm,
owls here.
very strange.
Um, okay, I think I've answered all the questions. Thank you for your comments, and I will now uh, go back to the meeting and uh, stop the live stream and stop